Okay, well, thank you all for joining us today for this event on the upcoming Moldovan presidential elections, as well as the referendum to codify EU accession into the Moldovan constitution, which will be taking place this weekend on the 20th of October. Um, Many commentators have said that these elections are, possibly the most consequential in the country's post-Cold War history. And I'm very certain this will be an interesting discussion. My name is Galen Dahl. I'm the managing editor of Visegrad Insight. And before I introduce our guest, I want to explain just the general format of today's discussion. The first part will be on the record, and as you can tell, it's being recorded. And the second half is an off the record Q&A, and this is kind of the I'd say this is kind of the unique aspect that I hope you really get to kind of engage with, because it's the opportunity for you to really ask questions and get your kind of your thoughts heard, as well as kind of trying to address specifically what concerns you might have or interests regarding the topic. So I would like to encourage you, even during the first half of the discussion, to begin kind of populating the chat box with any questions that you might have. Afterwards, of course, you can raise your hand, and I'm very happy and eager to take direct questions from the floor. But if you'd prefer to write them out, please do so as we're chatting, and that would be great. Um, One kind of final introductory remark. We're able to organize these kinds of discussions only thanks to the support of our subscribers. And we really appreciate all of your support from institutions, individuals, from NGOs, from just across the board of civil society. There is a specific discount code for people today who have not yet subscribed to us, and my colleague Natalia will be occasionally putting that into the chat box. And I encourage you to support us so we can do more and more of these events and kind of cover the democratic security within the Central and Eastern Europe. So, okay, without further ado, I think that's enough introduction. I am very pleased to be joined today by Carrie Longhurst, the Jean Monnet Professor at the Collegium Civitas and a visiting professor at the College of Europe. Carrie is also the executive editor of the Eastern Partnership Civil Society Forum Index on Democracy and Good Governance. And her research focuses on EU enlargement, the Eastern Partnership, gender, and as well Moldova and EU relations. So, Carrie, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thanks. It's good to kind of get up to speed with Moldova because I've been kind of friends with the country, I guess, for almost a decade. And just when I think I understand and know what's going on, something, affects something from the outside or something from the inside comes along. And you have to kind of go back and try and understand what's going on domestically and internationally. I mean, I thought before we move on to your questions, just a few kind of words, observations from my side. I think what's pretty clear in most of the commentary, most of the analysis about the election and about the EU referendum is that it's viewed as something which is going to be a critical juncture, a critical point in the country's, as you said, kind of post-Soviet, post-Cold War development in terms of its foreign policy, its socio-economic development, its regional status, everything. But at the same time, of course, it's going to have constitutional implications. Of course, it's going to set the country on a certain path this way or that way. But I think we also still have to remember that the country is still very much a country in transition. And a lot of the problems, the real crucial problems to do with the rule of law, to do with independent media, independent judiciary, inflation, lack of job creation, these inherent structural problems in the country, which obviously exist elsewhere, are not going to be swept aside or dealt with just as a result of the election. So we have to see, I think, the results for the forthcoming election and referendum as decisive, yet really just the kind of starting pistol of another phase in the country's development. So I think we have to get a balance between seeing it as important, but at the same time realizing that it's just one step towards a certain future.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I appreciate those ones. And you're absolutely right. There are institutional concerns that'll go on for decades. And I'm interested to see, well, we'll get to that in a minute. Before, I'm going to start you with a question that I think it was a key story from last week or a week and a half ago, that the accusations made by the current government in Chisinau that there is kind of a large scale scheme to buy votes that are being orchestrated by Russia. And my question, I guess, is, could have this been foreseen, and have the Moldovan authorities done enough to kind of done countermeasures to kind of ensure that there's an integrity that will be maintained in these elections over the weekend?
Yeah, I mean, this was kind of expected, and I'm not quite sure how much more the authorities, either centrally or regionally in Moldova, could actually have done in terms of preparedness and setting up remedies and methodologies to um, and it pushed back on Russian influences, which, as you suggested, came in very obvious forms in terms of payments and or loans, not just payments to
Mm-hmm.
individuals, but also typical, disinformation media techniques, impersonations of certain candidates. So the whole kind of, range of Russian influential techniques was being used in the case of this election. So it was expected, and I don't think the authorities could have done more in terms of preparing the nation, in terms of preparing voters for these types of influences. There was a couple of opinion polls recently conducted within Moldova by some think tanks and some civil society organizations about the election, but they also asked questions to try and find out whether Moldovan individuals were aware of Russian influences being at play during the run up to the election and the referendum. And I can't remember the figures offhand, but I think it was over 68% of individuals agreed or said yes, they were aware of these techniques at play, and they agreed that they were having malign and negative effects on the feed of information and how much they could learn about the genuine nature of the election. So, and I think that's testimony to the way in which citizens were prepared by the government for these malign influences, but not just the government. I mean, I think that some of the very effective messaging about the deleterious effects of Russian influences comes from civil society groups and those groups and NGOs local to Moldova who work on media, independent media, freedom of information, freedom of association. So it's not just the government. In a way, I think citizens often rely more on the civil society organizations to kind of provide corrections to some of the disinformation coming from outside sources. And I think as well in terms of, Western governments or the EU and the role that Western external players can and should play towards this disinformation, I think we have to tread very carefully and leave this job as far as we can to Moldovan authorities and Moldovan CSOs, so as not to kind of put ourselves into the position as being, interfering in this national election and referendum as well.
That's an interesting point, an excellent point, because you do often kind of hear from commentators that we need to do more. And of course, in the lead up in the last couple of months, you've seen just a barrage of European leaders going to Moldova to show their support, to show their indication of this. But I just want to do a little follow up question, because you mentioned that civil society organizations are the ones who have kind of been key in fighting Russian disinformation. And I just out of curiosity, how healthy do you consider the civil society in Moldova, perhaps in comparison to other European countries, like Hungary or something? I'm not sure that you would know, but it's just, do you can think is it a robust? Do they have enough support, both
Yeah.
financially?
I
Yeah.
mean, at the moment, obviously, because of the nature of the government, there hasn't been the kind of foreign agents law that's been introduced in Georgia or elsewhere. So civil society in Moldova has been, I would argue, more or less able to thrive and develop. The number of CSOs, especially small grassroots CSOs, are really abundant and numerous in Moldova. You'd have to check things like CSO Monitor or Civitas and all these types of organizations who monitor the health of civil society in Moldova. But my understanding is that it's fairly buoyant. Registering a civil society group, a new organization in Moldova is relatively easy and quick. So there aren't many barriers, many hindrances that the authorities put in place to allow CSOs to grow and develop. Having said that, like all countries, East and Western Europe, and including Eastern Partnership countries like Moldova, there are fake CSOs. We know that there are government-owned or government-promoted non-governmental organizations, business, oligarch-related so-called civil society organizations. But I think Moldovan citizens are increasingly aware of where genuine civil society is and where it isn't. And people are increasingly more savvy about how we define civil society groups and how they fit into the Moldova's polity. I think just to kind of extend my answer there, I think one problem is, though, that is hard to overcome, and from what I gather, is that whilst you might have civil society groups operating effectively, countering Russian disinformation, contributing to the national debate about European integration, etc., it's not always so clear how effective and how open Moldovan authorities are, central government in particular, at actually involving civil society groups who often have really high level expertise in Europe-related issues actually into the policy making, the European integration, the country's attachment to the European Union. And I think there's a missed opportunity there. I'm not quite sure how I can explain it, but maybe there's just some suspicion on the side of the government to actually fully engage civil society groups. But maybe we'll touch upon that later, because that definitely is going to impact upon how smoothly the country and how legitimately the country can move towards its EU membership.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, I guess I'm not terribly surprised. There is a trend where there's kind of a disconnect between government and civil societies throughout the region. But the fact that it's so healthy and, as you said, so buoyant, it is surprising that they're not at least trying harder to kind of integrate them. Well, okay, so no, you said that. I think you said 68% are aware of at least the Russian disinformation that is affecting them within society. Okay, with that being said, do you think that the interference, whether or not like through the vote buy-in scheme or just the barrage of disinformation, specifically with like say like the threats, I believe there's been a narrative, a threat that like basically if Moldova votes yes to kind of join the EU, that they'll become the next Ukraine. That this is that essentially they're preparing themselves like for an onslaught of Russian true like more physical aggression. Do you think these narratives will have an impact, or has the awareness raising and the media literacy done enough of its work that you think that they won't shift the election too hard in one direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can, well, I think first and foremost, as the Brexit vote showed, a lot can be achieved in the last few days before an election in terms of switching people's minds, getting them to reappraise, looking at the big picture. Some voters at least, make the ultimate decision within the last few days before they actually go out to vote. But in terms of answering your question about how effective such disinformation and lack of media literacy can have, I mean, I think if you look at the current intention to vote patterns of people right now, it seems like Maya Sandu, who obviously personifies the country's European future, transparency, orientation towards the West, she's leaps and bounds ahead of the closest contenders for president. So that really suggests that perhaps all of this Russian-led interference and the interlocking they have with local oligarchs or oligarchs who are outside the country isn't perhaps having its a decisive effect in turning the country round and voting for Moscow friendly, Moscow leaning individuals. Having said that, as we know, if Maya Sandu wants to have a full win straight away, she has to get more than 50%, and arguably a lot more than 50% of the vote to have to claim that the future of the country will and must lie with Europe. And that's where perhaps in a second round, which might involve one of the two other close runners in this election. This is where perhaps the Russian-led influence, propaganda, disinformation can have more of a decisive effect in terms of encouraging voters, the non-Sandu voters, to come ahead, might have an effect. But I think there might also be a kind of nuanced effect of the Russian external influence, because the two second kind of runners, second and third runners, in the presidential campaign are kind of, they're not speaking as pro-Russian, pro-Kremlin candidates. I mean, this is obviously something they keep in their handbags. We know
Mhm.
it. But what they're tending to do more is saying that Moldovans shouldn't feel they have a choice, that they shouldn't feel they have to choose Europe or they have to choose Russia. And this is more nuanced. It seems really reasonable. But ultimately, what that means is it's going to weaken the pro-EU vote and weaken the country's maneuverability to move towards the European Union sooner or later. Or they try to present themselves as being open to a European future, but not really. So I think the Russian influence is what we're going to see this next week and afterwards is going to be both obvious and nuanced at the same time. And I think Russian voters might be encouraged to not vote Sandu because they think the other contenders will be more reasonable, give a balanced approach, keep the door open to Russia, but not close the door to the European Union. This just seems to be panning out right now as the kind of crux of the second round of voting, if we get to that.
That's very interesting. Now, yeah, I haven't really read that, but that's so. I mean, could you imagine the scenario where the referendum gets voted yes, meeting the threshold as well, but then in the second round of elections, just to let everybody know if they're not aware, it would happen on November 3rd, 2 weeks time after. Um, could you imagine then actually Sandu losing? So there would be a weird there because that would be a very strange moment, right? Where you'd have a secret kind of pro Kremlin kind of candidate in the background, but the referendum that has been codified in the constitution means that he has to push forward with EU integration. Could you imagine that as being a possible scenario?
Yeah, I mean, in the stuff that I've been reading by Moldovan commentators, it some kind of, ambiguity. Most people are saying, and I think it's pretty clear from the data and the polling, that we can expect Sandu to win, but how big her majority is first round, or if we go to second round, is the point of consideration. At the moment, polls suggest that the vast majority of people who do choose to vote, I mean, around 70% saying they will vote for the kind of pro-EU constitutional change. But in any case, it's not probably not going to be a big majority either for Sandu and or for the election. And this is the kind of, yeah, the crux of it really, because how even after we get a yes, yes, how legitimate, how big a level of support, how big a majority is there really going to be to give this pro-EU integration route a real strong legitimacy and a real mandate. And that's
So,
going to be fiddled with afterwards. That's going to be the point of contention for the media, for kind of Kremlin-leaning individuals.
do you think that then would we what would okay kind of looking forward, I know that we're focused on of course the elections in just a couple of days, but it is kind of important to kind of that this is setting the stage for next year's or next summer's parliamentary elections in Moldova as well.
Yeah.
In this kind of circumstance where we can imagine like a yes yes where it's Sandu and it's a yes for the referendum, what risk do you think that this poses for those parliamentary elections? Could it be stalling, or would people kind of demand a quicker movement? And if that's maybe not as, or at least not perceived to be moving as fast as it could they potentially really struggle in the parliamentary elections?
Yeah, I mean, these parliamentary elections are going to come around really quickly. And as you say, they are connected organically to the type of result that comes out of these two votes right now. If it's a yes, yes, if it's like a strong majority for EU membership, if Maya Sandu gets a strong level of support in the first or second round, I think what has to happen in order for those parliamentary elections to boost that pro-European movement and get everything, going ahead. A lot of progress on EU integration has to happen between right now and the elections. The voters are going to have to see and feel some tangible results, which means that the EU as well and the EU member states are going to have to be prepared to push the enlargement talks ahead very swiftly to fulfill that idea of there being an expedited or slightly fast-track route to membership, to signal to the Moldovans that we recognize your European aspirations and you have voted, we're going to fulfill our side of this, and even talk a bit more confidently and boldly about having a specific date for membership in mind. So as voters don't feel that, okay, we're in support of this, but we need to know how and when this is going to come about actually becoming really close to the European Union. And I think part of that as well, ordinary citizens and voters are going to have to be given a real sense that becoming a member of the EU is not a far off distant project or something very remote to people's lives, but it's going to have to be linked policy-wise to job creation, tackling inflation, improving the socio-economic daily life of people. So this, like I said before, this is a starting gun. And if we get a yes, yes, which obviously I think most of us want, this is going to have to be backed up by tangible developments afterwards. I mean, the huge amount of money that was pledged to Moldova recently, that's going to have to be, the dots are going to have to be joined up, and the money and the finance and the granting is going to have to be used in ways which really do improve people's everyday lives, to give them a sense of EU integration isn't just about elites and foreign policy, but it's something which delivers for its citizens and institutions as well.
So I've got you've kind of triggered a couple questions for me on that. One is which is Poland, as of January 1st, are taking over the role of the European Council presidency, and they've made it one of their kind of stated, of course, priorities is security through enlargement, and of course Moldova is one of those key elements. But I mean, but I'm thinking about brass tacks. Like, really, is it possible? Like, what is possible in the next 6 months or 7 months before the elections? What kind of tangible results could be made? That actually makes me a little worried for their situation, because I mean it seems like it's a long time, but as you kind of stated, like, this is going to come around very quickly. And if people need to see, what do you think, if they had set a date, like would that be enough, or would they have to need to see some kind of economic improvement in their lives already, like in the short term?
Yeah, I think history shows, way back in 2004, previous enlargement, giving or signaling a date is very important, but not just symbolically or rhetorically, but it gives domestic stakeholders a time frame to do the types of huge scale reforms that are needed to become an EU member, not least of all for a small country like Moldova, where in so many areas it's still way behind EU norms and standards and laws and whatnot. So I think for Moldova and eventually Ukraine and perhaps Georgia, the signaling of a date is both politically important but practically important as well. But I think luckily for Moldova, I mean, there is a lot to do, and it's a relatively short time period in which tangible results have to come about. Being a member in the Eastern Partnership for so long, and being in many ways a exemplary member of the Eastern Partnership, and having a president who has tied her political fortunes and her personal credibility to EU integration, it means that in many ways a lot of the ingredients are in place already. And what can the EU do in terms of acting swiftly and fulfilling these EU aspirations for Moldovans? Extending trade concessions, bringing the country even closer to the single market, extending the four freedoms, supporting small and medium enterprises, which will impact positively individual, Moldovans. Many Moldovans are small scale business people, small scale farmers, and these kind of things really matter. Um, Improving the business environment spreads the kind of the wealth or the benefits of European membership. But then there's all the kind of really sticky issues that Moldova has struggled with and still struggles with institutionally, systemic problems to do with anti-corruption, independent judiciary or lack of independent judiciary. And it always strikes me, having followed Moldova's fortunes over the past 20 years or so, that despite so much effort and external support, the lack of good anti-corruption measures, the lack of an independent judiciary, we always come back to these as the root of so many problems. And I think until those fundamental issues are dealt with, EU integration in practical terms and political terms are going to be really difficult to really realize. I mean, for example, public opinion, if they see that the judiciary is corrupt and not independent, and if they see that the judges are important for the integration process, they're not going to see it as valid because they don't view the judges and the political administration in positive terms. So the EU is going to have to really, I think, in a way, step out of its comfort zone and double down on the problems to do with independent judiciary and rule of law and anti-corruption. Because without these fundamental areas being sorted out, EU integration is going to hit a barrier and lose its credibility in the eyes of people.
That's and those are unfortunately the big ones that are not easy to switch and not easy to fix and take time to kind of implement. So, but you're right. I think having a plan in place and maybe having some solutions, that would be the goal of the next government or next presidency. I have one question, one kind of final question before we go off the record. I know we're getting close to the time to tell you so, but I just have one more that I want to ask. It's going on the opposite scenario. Of course, we're expecting a yes from the polling, and I agree with you that is what expectations are. But what would be the implications of a no vote if it does occur on Sunday, or if it doesn't meet the threshold? Things like this. What would happen to Moldova? What would be their future? What would it look like?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't rule it out. I mean, it's a gamble doing this. When I heard about, the president's plan to link the e-referendum to the presidential election, I thought, wow, this is really brave. She's popular. If you look at opinion polls over the last few years, she's, I think, the most popular politician that consistently popular politician that the country has had, and she's worked hard, and she's had to push against lots of stereotypes and barriers by being a woman, by being a single woman without children, without a family. All these things were not necessarily well received amongst certain Moldovan stakeholders. So she's succeeded at being consistently popular for many people for quite a long time, and I guess that gives you confidence. But having said that, some of the most dodgy, in my view, no, widespreadly viewed as dodgy politicians in Moldova, who have played a role in stealing money from the country in a very brazen fashion over the last decade, are also popular in some quarters. So public support for politicians is in Moldova is sometimes really hard to fathom. People like Ilan Shaw, people like Plahodniuk, and other oligarchs who have played a role in Moldovan politics in recent times or over a long period are popular in some areas of the country. So their role in shaping the country in the future should not be underestimated. How would the country look in the case of a no or a bare kind of margin in support? The country will go back into a limbo. The country will be chaotic. Polarization, which is still there and always was there, will bubble up to the surface. Leaders in Transnistria and Gagauzia will gain a fresh sense of confidence, and so regional disparities will re-emerge. The economy will backslide. The grey economies, in other words, the informal economy, will grow bigger again because individuals and people will lose faith in the state institutions. I'd expect people would go and live in Moldova. So migratory pressures or outwards migration would would probably speed up again. I think that the countrysides, the rural areas would depopulate. So the country would, I won't say implode, but all of the kind of resilience that has been slowly built up over the last 5 years or so will probably weaken over time. So, yeah, limbo, a kind of hollowed out state is, I think, the direction in which Moldova will go, and the best and brightest will go to Romania, those who hold an EU passport and go further afield. And I think that the very powerful and effective diaspora of Moldovans that exists in Western Europe, they may well disassociate themselves from the country, and that is a huge loss of resource because the diaspora is quite a strong
Wow.
force for building the resilience of the country. So not good news.
No, no. I'm sorry to end the recording on kind of more bleak, but I think it's important for people to understand what's at risk. I think this we need to kind of spell that out rather clearly why this is such a pivotal election and referendum. Okay, so it's time for us to end the kind of official recorded part. We'll move on to the Q&A.